Well, it's Patreon choice time for the 5-minute guides, and they've chosen the Kamchatka, one of the most effective Japanese warships to never actually serve in the Japanese Navy. Ostensibly, believe it or not, this thing flew the flag of the Imperial Russian Navy, although many other ships in the Imperial Russian Navy probably wish that it didn't. Originally, Kamchatka was never supposed to be anywhere near a battle or indeed a warship. It was originally designed and started construction as a coal transport of all things. But with increasing naval tensions, she was converted during construction to serve as an armed fleet repair ship, a role in which her large cargo holds, sturdy construction, and powerful cranes were thought to be very handy. And so she would enter service with the Russian Navy in 1903, less than 2 years before her ultimate fate, with a displacement of just over 7,000 tons, a speed of just over 12 knots, and an armament of half a dozen 47mm guns. She could carry half her own weight in cargo, and her speed, whilst significantly slower than most warships, was still adequate to keep up with a fleet that was in transit mode. Albeit, obviously, couldn't actually keep up with a fleet in battle, assuming that the ships that were taking part in the action were capable of their respective top speeds. The outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War would find her based in the Baltic, and so when the call went out to summon support vessels for the 2nd Pacific Squadron, the almost new repair ship was brought into the formation. This would later be widely regarded as a bad move, and would make a lot of people very angry. From the start of the voyage, the Kamchatka proved to be an endless thorn in the side of the fleet and its admiral, Admiral Rossesvensky, who would launch many pairs of binoculars at it, and in the following months would eventually resort to keeping the ship relatively close by, mainly so that he could scream invective and insults at it as a form of stress relief. Why? Well, let's take a look at some of the highlights of its activities during the voyage of the 2nd Pacific Squadron. Some of these might be familiar to those of you who have seen the video on that. So, whilst the fleet was still making its way across the Baltic, the davits aboard the cruiser Zemchug failed and dropped a cutter into the water. These are these sort of C-shaped or G-shaped miniature cranes that hold boats up and allow them to be lowered into the water. So the faulty davits were taken down and sent over to the repair ship, where they were hoisted aboard, whereupon somebody managed to hit the release on the ship's cranes and dropped the entire collection into the ocean, where they sank. So far, so good. Well, having made it to Denmark, Kamchatka then signalled she was under attack by torpedo boats. When people said, "How many?" and "How?" She replied, "Oh, there's about 8 of them coming from all directions," which of course caused a bit of panic, but was also a completely false alarm. Shockingly, the ship does not appear to have been the prime instigator of the Dogger Bank incident, although she did start proceedings that day by accusing a passing Swedish ship of being a Japanese torpedo boat, which probably set the rest of the fleet somewhat on edge, and thus probably played a part in the hair-trigger discipline which precipitated the main incident. With that debacle out the way, on their way to Tangier, Kamchatka wandered off for her own little side quest, and no doubt many of the fleet were quietly hoping that she'd get lost and not come back. But she did eventually reappear with a highly gripping tale, stating that she'd fought off no less than 3 Japanese warships, and was over 300 rounds short on ammunition from her anti-torpedo boat guns, which she'd used in the engagements. Now, bearing in mind that at this point the British were still kind of hemming and hawing and maybe flip a coin with regards to blowing the entire Russian fleet out of the water as a result of the Dogger Bank incident, the fact that the ships that Kamchatka had engaged had actually been civilian vessels from Germany, France, and Sweden didn't exactly do anything to endear the ship to the rest of the squadron, since that pretty much brought in everybody else who had any kind of serious navy in the North and Baltic Seas. This was mitigated only by the fact that Kamchatka's gunnery had been so poor that none of the ships she'd engaged had actually been hit, and indeed, in at least one engagement, the fight supposedly had gone on for a fair while before the other ship had even noticed it was under attack. As the end of the year approached, Kamchatka did its part for fleet morale by finding a newspaper on a passing collier, which claimed that the Japanese attacked the part of the fleet that had been sent via the Suez Canal. This assault supposedly took place in the Red Sea and resulted in damage to a number of Russian ships. In a shock to almost nobody, it turned out that this too was a complete fabrication. Nonetheless, a few days later, around lunchtime, the flagship, the Suvorov, received a signal that Kamchatka had gone off course and was sending out the signal, "Dangerously damaged, cannot proceed." As it turned out, the damage was nothing much more severe than cosmetic damage from sea floating debris, and the ship eventually sheepishly found its way back on course. Shortly thereafter, as evening drew in on another day, a cloud appeared on the horizon behind the fleet. It was once again the Kamchatka, now complaining that due to bad coal she could not keep up sufficient steam, and duly began to fall back even further. The captain asked permission to throw 150 tons of supposedly bad coal overboard. Admiral Rossesvensky, meanwhile, reckoned that the problem was more likely due to a number of the crew not performing their duties much, if at all, and refused permission to throw the coal overboard, but did grant permission for anybody who was found to be the actual cause of the problem to be thrown overboard instead. Again, mysteriously, the Kamchatka suddenly developed the ability to keep up with the fleet. Having been quiet for several days, the Kamchatka decided that things were too boring, and in the middle of a storm, whilst the fleet transited the coast of Angola, issued the code message, "Do you see torpedo boats?" No, no one saw torpedo boats. Please be quiet. Eventually, the fleet made it to Madagascar, where Kamchatka proved that incompetence was not limited solely to remaining afloat and underway. Now the ship was anchored, it discovered new ways to mess with the Russian fleet. Whilst firing a salute to honour a man who died of disease in port, a live shell was used, hitting the cruiser Aurora. And a week or so later, completely out of nowhere, it suddenly signalled that they were sinking. There was much rejoicing, but on investigation it turned out that basically what had happened was there was a cracked steam pipe in the engine room, which was relatively easily fixed, and so the cheers of the rest of the fleet had to be silenced. A little bit later, in February, still in port, one of the sailors from Kamchatka took 2 lifebelts, jumped overboard in the middle of the night, and struck out for the shore. By chance he was spotted swimming, and a searchlight was turned on him. When hauled aboard the flagship and interviewed as to what the heck he was doing, he said, "I was tired of being on board, I could endure it no longer, and I wanted to go on shore." The officers who'd hauled him out of the water recorded that they quite understood the man's feelings. Finally, after a number of lesser shenanigans on their way across the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific at the Battle of Tsushima, the Kamchatka finally did something useful, absorbing Japanese shell fire. She was hit quite hard, with her steering disabled. She ended up circling until another shell hit her engines, leaving her dead in the water. The crew then tried to evacuate, but as the boats were lowered, Kamchatka rose by her bow and sank with a tremendous roar of steam and escaping air, taking her captain and a number of officers and men with her.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.